I think, therefore I am. But I'm thinking all the time, and I don't know who I am. Am I? Are you? I'm in the middle of nowhere, and it's a good place to be. Welcome to Just Nowhere with Dr. Samuel Zinner.
Welcome to Just Nowhere, episode 21, with your host, Dr. Samuel Zinner, in the mountain village of Aula in Tuscany, Italy. Tonight, I have the distinct privilege of being granted an audio interview with Joel Engel, author of The Last Stop, The Twilight Zone, the Biography of Rod Serling, published in 1989, republished in 2014. So sit back and enjoy. Thank you. Would you please introduce yourself and tell us who you are, where you are?
I'm Joel Engel. I used to be a journalist. I worked for a number of papers. I worked for Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, a bunch of magazines, and then I started writing books when I got an offer from an agent in New York who liked my writing and something that he'd seen. So I am now a long ago journalist, a recovering journalist. I'm very happy, given what's happened to journalism, to no longer be a journalist. But I still write books occasionally, and I contribute to Hollywood from time to time as well.
I know you wrote a splendid biography on Rod Serling. Could you just briefly tell us what other books have you written?
I've written about 20-something books.
All right.
I wrote, after the Serling book came out, Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, died, and the publisher, who was it? I think it was Hyperion, said, well, we need a biography of Roddenberry. Who was most like Roddenberry? Well, Serling was like Roddenberry. Who wrote Serling? Oh, get Engel. So I wrote that. I've co-authored. They used to call it ghostwriting, but it's co-authored because your name's now on the book, and sometimes even on the copyright line. I wrote. I'm looking at my bookshelf now just to pick some out.
Sure.
George Foreman's autobiography. I wrote the book that the Disney movie The Rookie was based on, about a 35-year-old high school pitcher in Texas who suddenly finds himself in the major leagues. I wrote that book, which I'm looking at right now, the Korean edition. I wrote a book called Screenwriters on Screenwriting and followed that up with Oscar-winning screenwriters on screenwriting. I wrote a book about a black man born in the heart of Jim Crow, Mississippi, 1941.
Excellent.
Slept on a dirt floor of his grandparents' shack. His grandparents were sharecroppers, and somehow he had a dream of being both a pilot and a general, which at the time and place he was born and the color of his skin, was basically saying, I'd like to have a herd of unicorns, but he made them both come true. The heart of the book is an adventure in Vietnam. He was shot down in the jungle for 3 weeks with his white racist captain, and what happens between them in order to stay alive, and the relationship is really pretty phenomenal. I wrote a book about a bunch of essays about Martin Luther King, called What Would Martin Say? I wrote a true crime book, takes place in Los Angeles in 1956, about a serial rapist terrorizing the city's lovers' lanes, and the LAPD zeroed in on a man who had nothing to do with it, but because of the color of his skin, they went after him. And I wrote a book called Scorched Earth about a corrupt Department of Justice prosecution of a private company. So as you can see, I don't specialize in anything.
Right.
Both my regret and my self-patting on the back. I'm just interested in a lot of things.
Well, mentioning Martin Luther King Jr. Calls to mind that I just, by chance, stumbled upon a video on YouTube, just uploaded, I think, just about a week ago by Dick Van Dyke. Right, he's in his 90s now, but he has a YouTube channel. He's had it for 3 years, and this is his third video he's uploaded, so he's not very active. But what he does in this latest video is read a speech by Rod Serling, which was delivered in 1964, I believe, at a Martin Luther King Jr. Meeting. Right, and it was quite powerful. Actually, I don't know if you're familiar with that speech or not.
I am.
You are?
Uh-huh.
All right, doesn't surprise me. All right.
And
Yeah.
I actually just saw this. I didn't know about this, but I saw this the other day when a bunch of Martin Luther King stuff was being posted. I didn't know about Dick Van Dyke, who's actually kind of my neighbor. We live. Let's put it this way: we live in the same Costco zip code.
I understand. Yeah, so yeah, well, the takeaway from that, the memorable lines from that for me was that Serling insisted that hatred and prejudice should not be ascribed to what is normal for humans. It's not normal for the human state. It is a disease. It should be seen as a disease. So a powerful thought.
Well, it's a powerful thought, and it's also an incorrect thought.
No,
As I mean, he was Rod.
It's rhetorical.
Rod.
I understand.
Yeah, it's a disease we'd like to eradicate, but it's as natural as cancer, and all you have to do is look at history for that. You know, Rod wasn't very. He was raised Jewish, and he was in a town where there weren't very many Jews, and there was, at the time he was raised, there was a great deal of prejudice, and he kind of took it in a different direction, but it did affect him. But he wasn't. He's ignoring. He was ignoring. Basically, if you read the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, this is all in there. This is the hatred is a natural part of the human being that the gift from Sinai was supposed to help eradicate by creating new rules against it. But there's what I mean. Let's put it this: what could be more natural than I'm bigger and stronger than you, so I get what you have. What you have, what I have is mine. What you have is mine, and now you have to work for me, unpaid, or now I get to kill you for. I mean, it's
Right.
Human nature. Rod aspired to the highest aspect of our human nature, but he was, and it's lovely to see, and we all want to live in the universe, the moral universe that the Twilight Zone, and even more so Rod's previous efforts in the 7 years before getting stuff on the air, in the 7 years before Twilight Zone went on. That's the kind of universe we'd all like to live in. It's
Sure.
not, though. What his comment about it, it was a very Rod Serling comment, but it's not true in the real world, and it's not true as proved by history.
Yeah, well, to be fair to him, I think, and you probably know the speech more intimately than I do, but just hearing it once, but I do seem to recall that perhaps his point was that we should not despair by invoking this argument or this claim that prejudice, right, is part of our nature, and so there's nothing we can do about it, right? So, and that I think is maybe a little more logical and palatable. Even though I agree with you, it does seem to be rooted in our species, right? How we treat the other.
He's right about that. America, in starting from about 1960, when Martin Luther King started to make a very big splash in the culture and in the mind. In a period of 10 years, um, America's mindset about race, they America really, by and large, obviously there's always going to be outliers,
Of
but by
course.
and large, swallowed whole the content of our character from the August 1963 March on Washington speech, the I Have a Dream speech,
Hmm.
is it's known. America really swallowed that. Unfortunately, it kept going. So nowadays we're at a time when to be race colorblind has been repurposed as racism.
Hmm.
So that's a separate thing. But Rod
Sure.
was right. We absolutely we learned it out of the American mind,
Hmm.
and we were taught it out of the American mind. I don't know anybody. I'm 71 today, actually.
Oh, happy
Uh,
birthday.
Thank you. And I don't know. I have never known anybody who didn't swallow wholeheartedly King's speech from August 28th, 1963.
Hmm. Well, before I get to really my first question that I had in mind, which of course would be about Rod Serling's youth, there was this quote that you give in your book, and it sort of doesn't fit into the rest of my question, so I would like to address it first and see if you have any reaction to it. It was interesting. It's a letter that Rod Serling wrote to the L.A. Times in 1964 again, and he was lamenting polarization. And the quote, which impressed me, is this: democracy, by its very nature, must not only countenance differences of opinions, but welcome them. Well, when I read that, I was thinking, wow, we think, and I think we're right? The polarization, I'm here in Italy, but in America, right, the polarization, cultural and political, is just, it seems to me, just drastic, catastrophic even. And, but, right, maybe we can forget, right, the polarization, right, of the early and mid 60s. But how do you think? I mean, you can't speak for Serling, of course, but you're certainly an expert on him. How do you think that he might react, right, to this very thought he had in 1964 if he were alive, seeing what is happening today?
Well, on the primary level, he'd be appalled by it.
Hmm.
On a secondary level, he would be applauding the democratization of opinion that social media has enabled.
Hmm.
And on the third level, he would recognize that social media has been a centrifuge that pushes people apart because we no longer have in this fractured cultural environment, we no longer have when he was active, when he was the whole entire time he was working, America had the Ed Sullivan Show, which was
Right.
among and Johnny Carson, which were countervailing centripetal forces to whatever else might have been pushing people apart. I'm thinking
Hmm.
of specifically 1968, which was Annus Horribilis
Hmm.
in America, but still in all, not as bad as the last couple of years,
Right.
because back then the center still held.
Hmm.
Everybody knew that this was a temporary uh, vacation away from the norms. Now we don't have that anymore. The center is not holding. The Overton window is permanently open. It changes by the day, but he would recognize that it was social media which was really helping push this. So, and as I said, he would be applauding the democratization
Hmm.
of of what it allows the average person, because he always wanted people to speak out. He spoke out. He wanted others to speak out. He
Right.
encouraged others to speak out. He was always trying to get people to do that.
Hmm. Wow. All right. Well, he was, and I have to give what they call the full disclosure, right? I'm no expert on Rod Serling, so everything I'm going to say, 99% of this is based on reading your wonderful book. And so it stands out to me, right, in the first part of his life, after his youth, but he's drafted the day after his high school graduation, right, to fight in World War II, or I guess to be trained first. And it was during the war that he said he would be a radio writer. Now, you tell the story of Melvin Levy. You say this is maybe the birth of a strong sense of irony, essential to his best writing. Do you recall that incident?
Yeah, of course they were on maneuvers in the Philippines, and they were climbing for several days in the mud and the rain, and the cloud cover was so bad, his platoon, that they couldn't get any of the the Piper Cubs or any of the other planes that were supposed to be dropping them supplies. They were hungry and thirsty. They were drinking water, rainwater from their ponchos, and finally one day, just when they were all very desperate, the clouds parted, and here come one of their little supply planes dropping crates of food to them. One of them dropped on the head of his good friend Melvin and killed him. Now, if that's not irony, there's no irony. And the entire Twilight Zone is built on irony. So whether it was that moment in which the Twilight Zone crystallized in his head, I don't know, because there were several years. Obviously, there were another 12 years before he started to develop the idea. But irony was always a big part of a sense of irony was always subtext to his writing. And so I think he had a finely developed sense of it.
It seemed poignant to me that he used some loose twigs, right, to create a Star of David on the temporary grave.
Yes, yeah. Again, he was proud to. He wasn't religious, but he was proud to be a Jew. Jews being
Cultural,
both a religion and a race. Yeah, but he was culturally Jewish, and of course, to the degree that especially Ashkenazi Jews like me have certain characteristics, and I think we do actually.
Sure.
Rod certainly had them.
Yeah, that brings to mind, right, in the post-war era, it seems that his marriage stabilized his life, but the attitude, all right, of this woman he was Carol, that he was dating, the attitude of her father. How would you describe that? His attitude towards Jews, because was not that the real cause of Rod, let's say, joining the Unitarian Church?
Well, he grew up in a petri dish of what we used to refer to as polite anti-Semitism, and sometimes not so polite. It's
right.
Generally it's in the mind of the era. It was associated with upper class country club Connecticut WASPs.
Right.
And he married into a WASP family, and her mother, especially his mother-in-law and grandmother, they didn't want him marrying this, quote unquote, dirty little Jew. And I'm, to Carol's credit, she fell in love with Rod, and she wasn't going to be dissuaded by that. And I don't whether he would have been happier marrying. Look, this is at a time when Jews were kept out of. They had to start their own country clubs because the country clubs were restricted. They started their own hospitals. They started their own schools. They were just starting to be admitted to the Ivy Leagues. So there was a lot of anti-Semitism. It was in the years after word of the Holocaust was becoming much better known than even in the days immediately afterward, when Eisenhower told his soldiers to record everything because someday people are not going to believe this. So it was an interesting time. It would have been easier for him. It would have been easier for Carol if they had each met and mated with someone of their own kind. That's a crude way of putting it, but it's also appropriate.
Sure, understood. Yeah. Well, it's in your book, and in what I've heard elsewhere, right? Not through reading, but right through different anecdotes and other lectures, perhaps. It wasn't always clear to me. It's not always clear to me just how deeply attached to his Judaism he was. It seems to me that it was probably deeper than some portrayed as, and the reason I say that is later, right, in the career there are stories, right? There's this enduring interest, a passionate, right, interest in the issue of anti-Semitism or hatred of Jews, and right there are these very interesting Jewish stories like the Messiah on Mott Street. So it's not as if he joined the Unitarian, and I'm asking this, it doesn't seem to me that just because he joined the Unitarian Church that right his Jewish identity or culture right is just extinguished.
Well, Jews are in the unique. I believe there are more Jewish Buddhists than any other
Right.
other religion. Jews are in
Right.
the unique position of being able to be both Jewish and something else.
Sure.
And so while he wasn't attached to Judaism, that is a religion. He was proud of being a Jew, and if you called him a dirty Jew to his face, he would have taken a swing at you. But that's not the same as being attached to Judaism. He didn't want to. I'm sure he didn't want anything to happen to Jews in this country, whether they were Reformed, Conservative, or Orthodox.
Sure.
But that he was a Unitarian, and which is, it's the religion without a religion.
Right.
It's in Ernest Pipes. He adored Ernest Pipes, who was the pastor. But in Santa Monica, the area of Santa Monica where the Unitarian Church is, this is basically like being going to a certain church in Bel Air, the toniest area of Los Angeles. It's not. You're not going to be called upon to make any sacrifices. You don't have to fast on Yom Kippur. You don't have to give up anything for Lent. It was the religion for people who aren't religious, and that was perfect for him. It was a moral. It talked about morality. There was a lot of morality talked about, but it was morality disconnected from the whole argument about if God doesn't exist, does morality exist? Well, there's ethicality, and then there's morality.
Sure.
And so he was. It was a very good religion for him to adopt. Also, because there's no possible way that even if he wanted, there was a very high-end synagogue very near their home, University Synagogue, and there was no possible way Carol was going to join that synagogue. So it was a very nice compromise.
Right. Well, as you say, there are a lot of Jewish Buddhists, even right. So if joining Unitarian Church doesn't mean one ceases to be a Jew. But anyway,
you can't, as Hitler reminded us, you can be a Catholic and still be sent to Auschwitz because you're Jewish.
Right. Yes. Yep. Yeah, so yeah, so I guess then I would try to wrap that thread of conversation up by saying that he remained attached to his culture, right? His Ashkenazi culture, and
Yeah, and don't forget, being in Hollywood at the time, he was very nearly, uh, well, the majority, I wouldn't say very nearly anyone, but pretty much everybody that he knew and worked with um, was was Jewish. Maybe not the executives so much, like James
hmm hmm
Aubrey at CBS, but a lot, probably the majority of the creatives that he dealt with were Jewish,
right,
and
right.
they all pretty much. I don't think he knew. I never came upon any correspondence with anybody talking about any of the Jewish holidays or anything like that. There was
Right, right.
no no citations of the Torah, nothing like that.
Of course, right, right, right. All right. So the of course, right after his marriage, right. So this era then becomes that's the rise of TV replacing radio, and so in the 1950s, he was writing for the Kraft Television Theater, and so at that I think the most prominent works, right, that he authored was Patterns and Requiem for a Heavyweight. Could you describe that phase of his career? And I think maybe you've pointed out that the basic style he was using here is he has very powerful character developments. But could you just go over that basic pre Twilight Zone phase of his career, writing career?
Well, he started selling scripts. This was an era when television was like the Wild West. It was, you know,
Hmm
it was Deadwood. You showed up and you either made a mark or you didn't. But the door was open for anybody because the producers at the time were hungry for material, and obviously everything was live. They didn't have videotape and tape delay and well, like that. So if you something that was played on the East Coast live was later shown on the West Coast via kinescope,
hmm
which is a camera filming a film camera filming the TV screen as it was being performed live.
hmm
But he sold a number of, started selling in 1952 in earnest, and it kept going on. And he was basically considered, and in his own, he wouldn't think that this was an insult because he thought of this as himself, a hack writer who's writing 30 and 60-minute scripts
Sure.
of no real import. And then the Kraft television episode called Patterns, which aired January 12th, 1955, was a 60-minute show about it took place in the corporate world. It's right around the same time as Executive Suite, and it shares um, uh, Ernest Lehman's Executive Suite, which is a fantastic film, and it shares a lot of the same images and uh, themes
hmm
of uh, man eat man, dog eat dog, and
hmm
ethics. Well, if you can get away with it, then it's ethical kind of thing.
hmm
But it was such a powerful, and it was so well done. The cast was fantastic. The writing was perfect, and it, it was such a smash.
hmm
The New York Times uh, reviewer Bowsley Crowther, I think that's his name, Bowsley Crowther. He went on, and you know, this is the days it was live. There were no do-overs. So if you
hmm
missed
hmm
it and you read the New York Times and you read all of the other newspapers in the country that were lavishing praise on this, you felt um, very upset by this, and they besieged Kraft, which was the sponsor of the show, and
hmm
NBC, which aired it. And it was the only, it ended up becoming a month later the only live show ever repeated. They went back and they did it
mm
all over again, and they hyped it. And his phone started ringing on January 13th, and basically didn't stop for about 14 years.
Uh-huh.
So now, fast forward until the summer of 1956. This is when he begins in earnest his relationship with CBS. He gets a call from the new producer of this show that was going to be called Playhouse 90. On Thursday nights, CBS was going to devote 90 minutes. This had not been done. A live performance of an original teleplay once a week for 90 minutes. It had never been done before. And the producer called him, Martin Manulis, and he called him and he said, "We want you to do the first two." So he gave him an adaptation to start the first show, which would have been October 4th, 1956. And it went over okay. It wasn't great, but the second episode of this was an original by Rod Serling called Requiem for a Heavyweight. Now it was about a boxer. I don't think I have to go into. I think most people are familiar with this in one way or another. But the themes of it were very close to Rod's heart, being used up, being unappreciated. What happens to you when you get old and out, and the cruelty of man's place on the earth in a universe that you go out without a cold and you in the snow without a jacket in the snow without shoes, you're going to get pneumonia and die. And It doesn't matter how much you pray. It doesn't matter what a good man you are, or a good woman. You're done for. You're going to freeze to death or get pneumonia. And so that was, again, so remarkable that CBS wanted him exclusive to them, and they wanted him to write as much as he could, and it eventually in 3 years led to, and he did some wonderful work on Playhouse 90. I actually think there are some Twilight Zones that are worthy of his talent, but in general, and he wasn't a very good screenwriter. We can talk about that if you want in a while. But because he was a word man, and his original instinct was radio. So words were everything. Dialogue was everything. He had to tell you what was going on. The movies are different. The movies are a visual medium. He never really was able to get that. But I think even how wonderful the Twilight Zone was in many, many episodes. These are 30 minutes. They're 2 acts, and the third act is, and that's the way it is in the Twilight Zone. But these 3 and 5 acts that he was doing in 90 minutes, some of them were just superbly written and beautifully performed. He did an adaptation of Ernest Lehman's novella, The Comedian, that is among the best things that have ever, among the best things from that era, certainly, of television, and performed by Mickey Rooney. If you didn't know anything about Mickey Rooney and that was the only thing you ever saw, you would go, "That man is phenomenal. That man's talent."
Right.
And he was. Right. So it was perfectly cast, perfectly directed, and perfectly written. By 1959, when it looked like he had one foot out the door, he had changed his agent. He went from this little lady named Blanche Gaines, who was the one who really got him started. She was a one-man shop, this little lady, but she's the one that really got him going. But he got the full court press from the big agency, Ashley Steiner, and he went with them, and he felt so guilty about it that he wrote a script called The Velvet Alley about how they give you 50 they give you $1,000 a week. In 1959, $1,000 a week was quite a bit of money, and that's how they suck you in. That's how they get you. That's how they the whole thing was basically a mea culpa. and it was about a writer, literally about a writer, played by Art Carney, who is guilty over having left his agent and succeeding. And
Mm-hmm.
he's guilty about it, and he loses his family because this was in Rod's mind. He had a very, very bad case of imposter syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
And it led him to say yes to too many assignments at a time. So he was always really busy. He wasn't getting the pleasure of writing anymore that writing used to give him. But as I said, so for those years, from starting in January 1955 until Twilight Zone debuted in October of 1959.
Right.
He was phenomenally busy. He wrote a couple movies. They were terrible. He didn't understand the form, but he was much in demand. They left their home in Connecticut where they were living, and they moved to Bel Air, basically Bel Air,
Mm-hmm.
between Bel Air and the Pacific Palisades. I think the address is probably Pacific Palisades.
Mm-hmm.
And they now had two little girls, and they were living the Hollywood life. He'd got plenty of money, but he's still stuck with I don't want to say agony, but he was still stuck with the conflict that came along with being Rod Serling.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody who is a happy, well-adjusted human being ends up being a writer like that. If you're not, if there's
Mm-hmm.
not turmoil inside, you're not going to end up doing what Rod Serling did.
Right, right. And you wrote that he wondered if that move to California, right, which is, I guess we could associate that with, right, the beginning of the Twilight Zone project, but he wondered if that move to California would enable him to retain his ethics and self-respect.
Yeah, I think that's he said a lot of things. He was he worried about how he was going to be seen. He worried less how he was going to think about himself.
Mm-hmm,
But remember, this is back in the era where this is not too. Let's put it this way: it's not too long after the era of the Algonquin Round Table, when the people there they considered it slumming to go to go write for Hollywood for 15, 20 times what they were making
mm-hmm.
in New York.
Mm-hmm.
But they considered it slumming, and they all did it.
Sure.
It was considered slumming to, his real aspiration was to have been a Broadway playwright. And so anything less than that was considered slumming. Things were very different back then. The petri dish that he grew up in, these were the highest aspirations to be a Broadway playwright.
Mm-hmm.
And if not that, then a great screenwriter.
Mm-hmm.
And the television was considered the booby prize, and now it's not. And,
Right.
And partially because of him.
Right. Well, as far as the Twilight Zone goes, what about the antecedents? Because I've heard a lot of, right, the 1940s, 50s radio programs, mysteries, and a lot of them are really sci-fi, fantasy-like. Do you know, did those have an influence on Rod Serling? Did he
Well,
listen to those? Like
I,
it's later than you think. I remember it's one of the titles of those radio programs.
Well, it's unclear what he listened to, other than he did listen, and he loved storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
He was a natural storyteller. Everybody that knew him growing up, including his older brother Bob, who was a very good writer in his own right. Rod he was constantly babbling. He
Mm-hmm.
he was a natural storyteller. So whether I don't believe I got to know Bob pretty well.
All right.
And I don't believe he said anything about the radio ever being tuned to shows like that.
Mm-hmm.
But
All right.
I do know that in the in the early 50s, or maybe even late 40s, he approached a radio syndicator named Walter Schwimmer, who with an idea called the Twilight Zone, and for a radio show. And Walter Schwimmer told me, he said, I have two claims to fame besides, or two claims to infamy, I think is the way he put it. One is, I was approached long ago by this young comedian who wanted to have his own show on the radio, and and he said, I told him no, I don't think he had it going on. His name was Danny Thomas, and he said, my second claim to infamy was that I got a proposal from this unknown writer for a show called The Twilight Zone, and that guy was Rod Serling. He said, so he said, so you can judge my astuteness by those two. But so he did. It was in his mind quite a long time, whether he liked it or not. See, it's not, Twilight Zone's not science fiction. Twilight Zone is this universe of moral, it twisted in a way so as to be, to point out through immorality and irony, moral universe. Basically all of the Twilight Zones that he wrote, there might be a couple of exceptions. They're all morality tales. They're all explorations of the human psyche and competing desires and
yes, you call them morality plays, right, in the book. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
The bad guy never gets away with it.
Right.
The bad guy always gets his comeuppance. And the only one I can think of, there may be others, but for purposes of this conversation, the only one I can think of in which the good guy, the hero, doesn't get what he wants or deserves is Time Enough at Last, when Burgess Meredith plays the man who just all he loves dearly is to read.
Right.
And there's a nuclear blast when he's in the vault at the bank, and he's the only survivor, at least for 17 zip codes that he can find. The world is destroyed, but he finds a library, and oh my God, he can read. The only problem is he drops his glasses, and the world is blurry without his glasses.
Right.
And that's the end. Now that's the most despairing of the Twilight Zones, with the possible exception of what I think is the best Twilight Zone, besides I think generally a fan favorite is To Serve Man. The Canaanites had come down and end up in To Serve Man. Yeah. But the fourth season, called On Thursday We Leave for Home.
Right, the hour episode.
Yeah, it's an hour episode, and it's very autobiographical emotionally for Rod Serling. It's about the captain. He has this whole colony. For 30 years, he's shepherded this colony. They've grown, they've had children, they're self-supporting on this distant planet. And he's the boss. He's the captain. Everybody looks to him. It's not a democracy. He says what it goes, but everybody seems happy. Now a spaceship comes and they're going to take everybody, and he ends up not going. He's not going to go. He stays behind alone on this asteroid, and it's so poignant, and it's so emotionally autobiographical. I can't watch that one without just tearing up every one of the 135 times I've seen it. And it's for Rod Serling, these were very personal. He wrote 92 of the 156 episodes, and almost all of them are very personal in one way or another.
The literary quality, right? That reminds me of a comment you made. I don't know if you made this or you're quoting someone, but comparing the twist endings, right? Those signature twist endings of the Twilight Zone to O. Henry in Outer Space.
Yeah, that was. I think that's accurate. Whether I don't know if I said it.
All right. Fair enough.
I don't remember. It's been a while since.
Sure.
But it they're twist endings. The some of them are like the Gift of the Magi, like the Burgess Meredith one that I just alluded to. That's kind of a Gift of the Magi ending. Neither the husband or wife gets what he wants or she wants. They end up losing. They both end up losing.
Right.
And that's what happened to Burgess Meredith in this. But they're all twist endings. Unlike O. Henry. O. Henry wasn't. O. Henry had been a criminal, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. He had done some time for something, but he wasn't compelled by Rod's sense of morality.
Right.
For sure.
All right. Well, you also, this is a transition period here. You also noticed that Serling began to, the word you used, the verb to drift, right, without the structure of the Twilight Zone schedule. Once the 4 seasons wrapped up, and at that point he was in too much of a hurry, right, to write what you phrase it, a work of distinction. And then Alden Schwimmer, right, told Serling to take some time off and write a novel or a play, and but he just couldn't do it, or he wouldn't do it. Do you think that there was some I don't know if I want to call it a character defect or some trauma that Serling was suffering from, maybe from the war years, that was at play in this inability?
Well, I don't know if you would have to ask him, and obviously you can't.
We're
Neither
speculating.
I don't. Yeah, I don't know if I do know what it was. What it stemmed from is, again, I think it was a combination of imposter syndrome. Saul David, who was a big time producer who became his friend, Rod's friend, he said Rod used to walk into a room with his tail wagging. Rod very much wanted to be liked. He wanted to be admired. And there was good reason to both like him and admire him. On the other hand, he was also shy. At social gatherings. If you had a dog, he's going over and talking to the dog, playing with the dog, because he could do that without feeling like he was just standing around holding a drink in his hand. But he had started being able to not just type out these scripts fast, but he would sometimes dictate them. Well, he dictated everything over. By 1957, 58, he was dictating into a dictaphone and having them transcribe. Which is no way to write. No real writer dictates, because you can't. You have to have the relationship with the paper, whether it's your hands on a keyboard and then going back again and again. But dictating is a fast way to do something, especially sometimes. For the Twilight Zones, these are 26-minute episodes. There's 4 minutes of commercials, which nowadays he'd go crazy, because now it's 20 minutes out of 30 commercial television. But it was 26 minutes, and basically he would have that done in 30 minutes. He'd have a script done in 30 minutes, dictating, including the stage directions and all of that, but all of the dialogue. Someone says this, so-and-so says that. But so he started taking so much work, and he had a big nut to carry, and there was a fair amount of work coming in, or a lot of work coming in. He was saying yes to everything. The only thing that I remember seeing in the hundreds of thousands of documents that he turned down, that seemed like something he might have said yes to, he correctly turned down when Warren Beatty pitched him on a remake of Citizen Kane. Which is just a terrible idea. It's like remaking Gone with the Wind, and Rod said, no, that's not for me. But other than that, he would say that he didn't want to do that. He just wanted, if you were going to hire him for something, he'd take it. He hosted game shows. He guested on game shows. He was just packing it in.
Mm-hmm.
And once your motor is running like that, you don't want to sit down and write a novel. Who wants to write a novel if you don't have to write a novel? Um, uh, just very short anecdote. My book on screenwriting, I interviewed Robert Towne, the great screenwriter, and after we were done, he said, "Well, that's the best interview I've ever given." I said, "Well, how'd you like to write the foreword to the book?" And he said, "Okay." So he wrote the foreword to the book, and when he turned it in, the editor said, uh, we want you to write a novel for us." And he said, "Why do I want to write a novel?" A novel is a very big deal. A screenplay, you're done in 6 weeks.
No,
So that was Rod too. So even he had 3 novellas that showed up in a collection called A Season to Be Wary. One of them ended up as or 2 of them actually ended up as night galleries. One of them was directed by Steven Spielberg. That was the one with Joan Crawford.
Right.
It doesn't make any the show doesn't make any sense, but we're by that point it was beyond having to make sense. It's about a woman who is blind and she buys the eyes of someone, and she gets eyes for 12 hours. She gets to see for 12 hours. She's a wealthy woman. She lives on the Upper East Side of New York. Well, right when she can take the bandages off and look, there's a blackout in New York. And she looks out the window and it's all black, so she doesn't see anything. Well, of course, if there's a blackout, there's cars still. She looks out. The cars didn't turn off their headlights.
Right.
So it doesn't, but again, you by that point, you're being told to just go with it. Just go with it. Okay, I'll go with it.
Right. Well,
So,
I think most people who know about the night gallery period, right, know that Jack Laird, even if they don't know his name, but Jack Laird was really in control of the whole project, and this is frustrating, of course, to Rod. And there's a quote from you I want to read here. "Compelled to write quickly, he usually failed to write well. Lacking the emotional equilibrium necessary to nurture his extraordinary talent, he wrote far below his potential, and he knew that very well." Does that apply also to the night gallery, or?
Yeah, well, although there are some very good night galleries. There's some very, very good night galleries. They're tearing down Tim Riley's bar. Anything that was about emotion, and the past coming back, present in someone's life, something like that. Anything that was semi-Twilight Zone-ish in its as a morality play. Those are his best work there. But he wasn't in charge of it.
Right.
In fact, he would turn something in, and Laird could rewrite it. Rod, when he was the boss of Twilight Zone, never rewrote any of the other teleplay writers. And he had some very distinguished ones working on that show.
Yeah, like Charles Beaumont.
Right, like Charles Beaumont. He didn't rewrite them. He said, "Well, if that's the way they saw the story, that's them." And I mean, who wouldn't want to work for? If you're a writer, who wouldn't want to work for a boss like that? But now he was against something of a tyrant by all accounts, and he was not happy.
Well, even the episode tearing down Tim Riley's bar, which I love, though the ending of it isn't quite what Rod Serling wanted, is it? It's a little too. I don't know how to describe it. There, I'll let you.
Pat. Pat.
Yeah.
Too pat. Well, again, he was. Rod saw things a certain way, and if you were not going to see things that way, there was a time back in the 60s when he was writing these. He tried to tell the Emmett Till story, the young boy from Chicago who was tortured and lynched, allegedly whistling at a white woman. He tried to tell that story, and the TV wasn't ready for that. Network TV wasn't ready for that back then. So he had been through the censorship wars,
Right.
and it took a big piece out of him. So now, if you're a writer for hire back for network, then you just say, okay, you know what, let's just pull this. But if you were paid to produce a script and you turned it in, the producer can do what he wants to it. You just say, okay, well, it is what it is,
right.
And I'll bitch about it in private.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, no, another one of I think a lot of people's favorite, among the favorite episodes of the Night Gallery would be The Messiah on Mott Street. Do you know what degree of control Serling had over that script?
I don't know. I actually,
all right.
I don't know. I don't know what degree of control he had at all, other than he claimed that he didn't have the degree of control that he wanted. Mm-hmm. And by all accounts, Laird was a guy who wanted what he wanted. Mm-hmm. Rod did get something of a comeuppance later because NBC tried to, or Universal tried to, they wanted a syndication package, and they were going to pair it with another supernatural series, whose name is escaping now. Maybe you know the title.
No, escaping me too.
Sense. Yeah, is it The Sixth Sense? Something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think so. Yes.
They needed something to tie them together, and they needed Rod Serling to do the on-screen connection between the two, as he did on Night Gallery. Mm-hmm. And his new agent negotiated such a great deal for him that he made more money just in those 2 or 3 days that he was filming than he had the entire 3.5 years of the Night Gallery.
Right.
So he did. So that was kind of that would come out of Jack Laird's profit participation. So that was one way to get back at him.
Get it. Yeah. I think the Messiah on Mott Street also is another, I think, manifestation of his, let's just call it his inextinguished, or his unsevered, at least cultural connection, right, to his Ashkenazi background.
I would think so. Now there's a bit of turmoil about that script because another writer named Cy Gomberg claimed that he had told Rod this story.
Right. I was just going to ask you about that.
Yeah, well, Rod was accused a number of times of plagiarism, and a couple times he copped to it, but none of it was intentional. I'm very certain he wasn't that kind of guy. He wasn't just going to go out and steal the story.
Right.
There's no sense that he did any of this intentionally, and whenever he found out about it, he made it right. So when Cy Gomberg confronted him about this, Gomberg had been telling these stories around Hollywood for years, and they knew each other. They were neighbors in the Palisades, and all I can say to you and your audience what I told Cy Gomberg: how could you just go around telling these stories and not using them yourself? What do you think was going to happen?
Yeah, or copywriting them.
Yeah, maybe Rod was. Maybe Rod unconsciously took it, like he unconsciously took other things, because he read so much and he wrote so much. I mean, his output is 10 writers didn't turn out what Serling did, and so I said, well, how could what do you think was going to happen? So I say that here too. I mean, how could you do that? How could you go ahead and start telling these stories and then get mad and you tell them in front of other writers?
Yeah, what do you expect?
I've been to parties with writers and everybody shuts up. So you don't want to say anything. Someone else is going to. Everybody's really quiet. So what are you doing? Oh, nothing. Are you working? Yeah, I'm working. What are you working? I can't tell you.
Yeah, understood.
So So whether he did or didn't, and the same thing happened with his last Emmy, um, uh, the about the
Storm and Summer.
Storm and Summer, about the delicatessen owner who takes in a little black kid.
Right.
It's like they used to call it. The New York Times had this thing called the Fresh Air Fund, and so every summer they would get underprivileged kids and they team them up. But that too was supposedly a a theft of some sort. But Rod absolutely insisted that it was based on something he'd seen and done. And of course, the idea is out there because every day, if you read the New York Times back then, every day in the summer there's stories of some of the kids in the Fresh Air Fund and who they're with and all of that. So that idea is out in the ether too. So there were other things that he was accused of basically purloining Requiem for a Heavyweight by Bud Schulberg, who'd written The Harder They Fall, right just before that. And Rod saw Bud Schulberg at a party and he said, "You're not sore at me, are you, Bud?" Well, Bud told me he was very sore at him. But then again, while thematically the two are pretty similar, they're not even remotely congruent. And the movie version that they finally released, because Rod really wanted it on Broadway. That was his dream, was to get Requiem on Broadway. That he was willing to drop everything to try to make that happen, but it could never happen. But the movie version from 1962 with Tony Quinn it's even better actually than the original TV version with Jack Palance.
Yeah, I agree.
It's got a better ending, and I'm pretty sure that Rod wrote that ending, and that it wasn't taken by someone else.
Yeah. Well, after Storm and Summer, of 1970, which you said you wrote, it received nearly unanimous praise. Well, of course, as you say, it's an Emmy winner. Then came, 4 years later, Planet of the Apes. So another success.
Well, that was a couple of years earlier, actually, Planet of the Apes. But Planet of the Apes is kind of murky ground.
All right.
Rod definitely wrote like I said, Rod didn't really have a sense of given the number of screenplays he'd written, the most prominent of which was 7 Days in May. But that was a talky movie. That was a very talky movie for a motion picture. Rod didn't have any sense of the visual form at all, and very talky. So the Pierre Boulle novel that this was based on is not like the movie at all. And what I read of what Rod turned in to the producers was, I think I phrased it in the book because my Dinner with Andre had just recently come out. My Dinner with Andre the Chimp. So it's not at all what it was. Just talky. It was talky. And let's put it this way: if you have Rod Serling and Rod Serling is turned into screenplay, you imagine Rod Serling would turn in. You don't then call Michael Wilson, the Academy Award-winning screenwriter of 1957 Bridge on the River Kwai. You don't call him in, a guy who'd written for David Lean, to pick up and fill in the holes and do that. There's some discrepancy over who thought of the ending, because it's not in the book, of the Statue of Liberty head in the sand.
Very Twilight Zone like the ending, the twist
very
end.
Twilight Zone, right? But there's some dispute over who thought of it. My inference was that Michael Wilson thought of it, but
maybe an influence from the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, but in subsequent years since the book was published, people said, "No, you got it wrong. Rod did it." And I went, "Oh, okay. I hope that's true. I don't think that's true, but it would be nice to think whatever it is. But you don't hire Michael Wilson at that high price, the Academy Award-winning writer of who had written for David Lean, Bridge on the River Kwai,
Yeah.
which is also, by the way, a Pierre Boulle novel, if I'm not mistaken, to come in. If
Yeah, I remember
if
I
you nail it.
first found the Planet of the Apes, the novel in French, right, as a paperback in my decade I spent in Morocco, and I read it, having grown up on Planet of the Apes, and was pretty astounded that there was really no connection. So
No,
yeah,
but it's a great title.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
a great,
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. Well, yeah, and so after that there comes what you probably called it, at least I've written down in my notes here, the descent into commercials, right? And which to me brings to mind like Bob Dylan's, what was it, 10 years ago or whatever, his commercial that he did for some lingerie. I don't know. I can't remember the details. But the difference, of course, is that Dylan's fans, will make up excuses for Dylan. But of course, Dylan is not this moral force, right? A moral figure or icon
well, I don't
that
know.
Serling was.
That's an interesting. It's an interesting connection between them. I think that Dylan's fans, I being among them,
Me too.
going way back, I would think that and in fact, I just coincidentally 2 nights ago rewatched the Martin Scorsese documentary on him, and I think that everybody thought of Dylan as a moral force, in the same way that they thought of Rod as a moral force. The difference is, I once knew, I still know someone who very well knew Bob Dylan's lawyer. And the lawyer told this guy that I know, he said, I've never met anybody in my life who was more infatuated with money than Bob Dylan. So Bob Dylan is, he's Bob Dylan. He's sui generis. There is nobody else like him.
Agreed.
And he's entirely entitled, in my view, to as many billions as he can get out of us.
Sure.
I even bought his way overpriced bourbon not long ago. I mean, he's putting his name on everything. It was okay, but it certainly wasn't worth I think $100 or whatever I paid for it. But Rod, the same thing. Rod really wanted to make a lot of money, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make money. At the time, he had to live in the hole he had dug for himself with that by prominently speaking out including to the FCC, about the awfulness of commercial television. And so he was hoisted on his own petard, but he went, well, it is what it is. I don't begrudge him that. If they're going to throw, back then, not the millions of dollars that they do now at celebrities. Celebrities they wouldn't appear in commercials in the United States, but they certainly would in Europe and in Japan all the time for a great deal of money, because they had recognizable brand faces. But I don't, back then, you throw 10,000 at them for an hour's work. Why not?
Why not?
Why wouldn't you do that? The problem is that he had dug a hole with that, and he had to live with it. But he's certainly entitled. He's a brand name. He was Rod effing Serling.
Right.
He gets, if a marketer thinks that you are worth the amount of money that we're willing to pay you just to show up and do this, good, go with God.
Yeah, you've arrived.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why not? The problem is that he had to be, he felt like he had to be embarrassed by it. And then I think then he ditched the embarrassment.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's the difference I'm sensing between Rod Serling and Bob Dylan. But my reaction to Dylan's lingerie commercial was, well, that's just Dylan doing what he's always done. Right? He's shattering the icons. Right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. No, I think that that's a good way to. I think that's a good way to think about it and do it.
Yeah.
Bob Dylan. Everybody wanted everybody. But George Harrison was heartsick that he felt like it was unrequited love between. Everybody wanted Dylan's approval and love because he was so stingy with it. Rod was the opposite. Rod wagged his tail. Dylan has not wagged his tail in his life.
Yeah, yeah. And also another comparison, that Serling was very politically engaged and then sort of became unengaged, right? Whereas that seems to be more or less what happened to Dylan as well. He's very politically engaged, or at least that was the box people were putting him in. And then
Right, and he never
sort
wanted
of,
to be in.
I never wanted to be in it. And
Yeah.
that became clear, right, with songs like "It's All Right, Ma" and "Gates of Eden," right? The emptiness of the different political philosophies, communism, whatever, right? But in any case, so. Towards the end of the book, you make a point. I really like it. Serling will be remembered. This is maybe not word for word. Maybe it is. Serling will be remembered for his successes, not his failures. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful remark to be able to make about a human being. A human being that we can make this remark about was truly a good and successful human being.
Well, I think that's true. I think we will remember him for his successes and not his failures. And he gave us so much to enjoy that the fact that we continue to enjoy this filmed entertainment all these decades later is a testament to him.
Yes, yes. And I was not aware of this piece of information until I read your book, and that was that Rod Serling's surgery, right, in which he died, was actually successful, right? But a heart attack then followed, and his veins were so I think you likened them to the veins of someone who's 80 years old, that there was just nothing that could be done.
Yeah, or even these days more than 80, since 70 is the new 50.
Right.
Yeah, they were. Well, he smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day. And
Right.
he was in the 50s. He was in danger of losing his fingers to Berger's disease because of lack of circulation, and he still didn't want to give it up. He was smoking in the hospital up till the end. He was having cigarettes stashed in the end. So yeah, it was one of the first going to be successful bypass surgeries, and then bye.
Yeah. I remember, just a personal anecdote, I actually remember being at school. I was quite young, so grade school, and for some reason in the library where I was, they had the radio on, which was never done. But it was as if they were following the story, or they decided to turn it on to hear the news about Rod Serling having died. And so it was, so a lot of people remember where they were when Kennedy was assassinated, or where they were on 9/11. I remember where I was, the day Rod Serling died. And
That's the title of an essay, if I ever heard one.
well, he made quite an impact, on my life. And millions of others as well, but certainly on mine.
I think there was. I use in the book what I still believe in. My book first came out in 1989. At the time, he is the most famous writer in the universe, in that he was the only writer you could recognize by name, face, voice, and work.
Yes.
And you can't say that about anybody else. Nobody knows what Shakespeare's voice sounds like.
Right.
So
right,
yeah,
right.
but so in that sense, he really was a trailblazer, and
Yes.
And in many ways, he was phenomenal. What a talent!
Yes. Well, I don't want to detain you much longer, but I do want to touch upon a point that you alluded to earlier that you would be interested in discussing. That is, right. Serling was made for words. It was made for the radio, made for the stage, the theater, not for the visual medium of television. Right, that's a good point. But
or the cinema. No, he was made for TVs. Yeah, not for the cinema.
All right. So, but in relation to that, I wanted to bring up, right, let's call them the remakes, right? So the BBC Radio 4 Extra series of Twilight Zone radio dramas. Have you ever listened to any of those?
No, I haven't.
All right.
I'm learning. I just learned about them just this second from you.
All right. They ran from 2002 to 2012. Of course, they were licensed by CBS Enterprises, right, and the Rod Serling estate. They used Stacy Keach for the narrator. And let's see, I don't have this memorized. I'm reading it off my little card here. Carl Amari was the producer. He's the CEO with the Falcon Picture Group. And the original Twilight Zone scripts were adapted by various writers. All right. I find, I don't know, 50%, 60% of them excellent, wonderful. And some of them, I think, even surpass the originals, right? And I wonder if that's because Serling's writing is really suited, at least in the Twilight Zones, for radio, or that's what he was, right? For audio medium, lacking the video. Anyway, so since you
Well,
haven't heard them, I don't know how much you can muse on this.
well, if you a lot of the episodes would have played just as well with minor
Hmm.
modifications
Hmm. Hmm.
on radio. But if you know you're going in, you're going to well, you got 156 scripts to choose from.
Hmm.
It's not difficult to find 15, 20, 40, 60 even
Sure.
that are adaptable, and that may be why you find some of them even better. For instance, like or Time Enough at Last, you couldn't that Burgess Meredith one
Hmm.
that I mentioned before. You couldn't do that on radio.
Yeah, some
You'd
of
have
them
to
are
sit.
forced, and that's one of them. There's too much narration that has to be added to explain
Right,
what a person is doing, which becomes a little annoying. Right.
right.
But there was also the last point here. There was also in 2000, right, season 2, episode 11 of Felicity. This is Help for the Lovelorn. And are you familiar with that?
No.
That's a remake of Five Characters in Search of an Exit,
Oh,
and
five characters. Okay.
they used the original director again, Lamont Johnson. And since you haven't seen it, I can only give my own impression really, really quickly, and that is, it seemed to me that they put two different stories together as an hour-long episode. So the Twilight Zone original was 30, but this remake was an hour, and it seemed as if they artificially joined two disparate stories together, and it really feels artificial, but still worth watching. But the reason I'm bringing this up is to go back to the original Twilight Zone episode of this. With the opening narration, I'm going to eclipse some of it and leave it out, but right, a collection of question marks stuck together into a pit of darkness, no logic, no reason, no explanation, just a prolonged nightmare in which fear, loneliness, and the unexplainable walk hand in hand through the shadows. Man, does that sound existential to you, or existentialist?
Well, it does sound existential.
Uh, are you aware? Did Was there any connection at all with Jean-Paul Sartre's No Exit?
It always struck me as more Pirandello than Sartre, but
All right, all right,
uh,
fair
or
enough.
or even Godot,
Sure.
Beckett. But it's not among it's let's put it this way, it's not among my favorite episodes
Mhm.
of my top 15. It might not even be 16.
All right, all right, fair enough. Well, the main difference, of course, between that episode and Sartre's No Exit is that, of course, he was really pushing, writing that would be situational, not with strong characters or strong character development. Whereas you do have those, at least some strong characters in the five characters in Search of an Exit.
Uh, in terms of character development, Rod did much better in the plays before and after Twilight Zone.
Yeah, like patterns.
Right. You didn't, there wasn't, in 60 minutes, he did pretty good. In his 90-minute stuff, I, my, I wish there was a way for everybody to enjoy these. I still haven't seen them on any streaming service. And I don't understand why CBS, Viacom hasn't made these available.
No,
So I think probably because the source material is from old kinescopes, and they figure out, we're not gonna subject viewers to that. But that's stuff that when I watched it, it was at the Museum of TV and Radio in New York on a little tiny screen with headphones. But they were just phenomenal in terms of character development. You really, Elia Kazan said a movie's about what does the guy want? Does the audience want for the guy what the guy wants for himself? And you don't, in Twilight Zone, you're kind of at a remove from that, but in Rod's work before, especially in the Playhouse 90s, you are right in there wanting what he wants and feeling what he feels.
Yeah, a wonderful writer, a wonderful human being. The world was a poorer place after his passing.
Indeed.
All right, well, thank you so much, Joel. I appreciate it. Do you have any closing words for the audience?
No, I enjoyed this. Thanks very much, Samuel.
No, you're quite welcome. You're quite welcome. Thank you.
If you enjoyed the program, please consider supporting this channel with a donation through Patreon or PayPal. And don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.